Hi, this is Eric White. This is the first in a series of screencasts on adding and updating tables of contents in OpenXML word processing ML documents. A very common scenario for developers is that they generate a document and then want to insert a table of content at some place in the document and then update that table of contents so that the page numbers are correct and it pulls the table of contents as appropriate from all of the headings or whatever styles they designate in their document. In these screencasts, I'm going to discuss a number of ways that you can accomplish these goals. To get started, let's take a look at some markup. I'm going to create a document. I've added 4 headings and a little bit of text to this document. There are 2 headings that are styled as heading 1 and 2 headings that are styled as heading 2. And to make things a little bit more interesting, I'm going to put a hard break here and a hard page break here, and this will cause the first heading 1 to occur on page 1, the first heading 2 to occur on page 2, and the last 2 headings, there's a heading 1 and a heading 2, to occur on page 3. Now let's insert a table of content. We do in fact see that our headings are on those pages. Let's save this document and close it. Let's look at this document in Visual Studio. I'm using the Power Tool OpenXML editor for Visual Studio. This Power Tool allows you to drag and drop an OpenXML document onto Visual Studio and open it up and prowl around inside of it. You can discern what the relationships are, and you can open specific parts in the Visual Studio XML editor. This makes it pretty convenient to manually adjust OpenXML documents or just to examine the markup. You can find and download this free add-on here. One thing that I'm going to do before I open the document in Visual Studio is that I'm going to get rid of the RSID elements and attributes. I find that those get in the way of explaining the markup, and we're not really interested in those in this video. I've written this little Windows Form application that uses the markup simplifier class and allows you to simplify the markup for an OpenXML word processing ML document. You can find out more about this little application here. The only thing that I'm going to do here is to remove RSID info. I inserted that table of content at the very beginning of the document. We can find the markup very easily right here at the beginning of the document. The first thing we see is this SDT element, which is a content control. SDT stands for structured data type, by the way. This content control is there so that it's easy to update the table of content after you've modified the document. Let me show you what I mean by that. I'll open up the document again, and let's say that I were to insert a page here. Then I could come up here and say update the table, update page numbers only, and you can see that the page numbers have been updated. This control that you see right here is that content control that allows you to update the table. That's the only purpose of that content control. You can have or not have that content control if you so desire. So just to show you, First, I'm going to make a copy of that document so I can play around with the markup a bit. I'm just going to delete the content control there, and I'll delete the close tags also. Save it. We can still see our table of contents, and it works just fine. The only difference is that we don't have that handy content control that allows us to update the page numbers or update the entire table of content. That's the purpose of that content control, and that's the only purpose of the content control. I send that one to the recycle bin and rename this one back to test.docx, and I'll reload it in the editor so that we can see the version of the document that has the content control in it. Now we're ready to look at the actual markup of the table of contents. First of all, you can see this heading up here, contents, which has a style of TOC heading. That'll come to play in a bit, in that when we programmatically insert a table of content into a document, we have to add the appropriate styles into the document so that the table of content looks the way we want it to. And dropping down here, we can see a paragraph that has a style of TOC1. Again, we're going to have to insert that TOC1. Now, here we can see an OpenXML field. Fields are represented by this interesting looking markup here. A field is comprised of 4 key elements and then some other elements between them. You first have a element w:"fieldchar, FLDCHAR, with a fieldchar type of begin. You then have another element of w:"instrtext, and that has some interesting content here with this TOC/O quote 1 through 3. We're going to talk about that in a bit. And then there is another fieldchar element with a fieldchar type of separate. Interestingly enough, fields can be nested. And here we can see the beginning of another field. This is a page ref field. This is an interesting field to look at in that we can see the entire field on one page of text. Up here we see the fieldchar with the fieldchar type of begin. We then see that instrtext element with, in this case, a page ref. Then we see a fieldchar with a fieldchar type of separate. And then down at the bottom we see a fieldchar with a fieldchar type of end. And to explain what these are about, between the begin and the separate, these constitute the instructions that tell the field what to do. This instrtext contains the instructions for the field. In this particular case, this contains instructions to insert a page reference to a particular bookmark with the automatic generated name of _TOC 3005188884. Then, between the separate and the end is the representation of the field. And this is where the content that Word generates for this field goes. So here we can see that Word has said that the content for this particular page ref field is 1. In other words, that bookmark is on page 1 after Word did the pagination. We'll see a fair number of these fields with a page ref in them. These are all the fields for the various entries in the table of content. We'll see 4 of them. And then when we finally get down to the bottom of the table of content, we can see here the field for the last page ref. And then we see one more fieldchar of a fieldchar type of end. This fieldchar with a fieldchar type of end is the end of the field that begins right here. This field, just as with the page ref, has a begin, it has the instructional text, it has a separate, and then everything between the separate and the end are the contents of that field that Word automatically generates. So I'm going to demonstrate what you can do with this. I'm going to close this. I don't need to save it. I'm opening up the document that has the table of content in it, and now I'm going to insert another hard page break right here. After repagination, heading 1 is going to be on page 2, heading 2 is going to be on page 3, and the last two headings are going to be on page 4. But I'm not going to update the table of content here. I'm just going to save it and close it. And again, I'm going to drag it to Visual Studio. This time, I'm going to do something interesting. Here we can see the begin, instructional text, and the separate for the TOC. When saving it, Word changed the runs that those elements are in. That doesn't matter. They can be in the same run, they can be in separate runs. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start immediately after the separate. There's a hyperlink here. I'm going to delete all of this content between the separate and the end. One thing I need to do is to put the end paragraph tag back in because that was in the stuff that I deleted. So now we can see all on one page the entire field for the table of content. Here we see the begin, here we see the separate, and here we see the end, and there is no content between the separate and end. I'm going to save that, and now I'm going to the settings part. I'm going to the end of the settings part. And I'm going to insert an element, update fields, with a value of true. Save that. I don't need to close it in Visual Studio. I can just come back here and I can open the document. And when I double click on that document and open it in Word, Word comes back with a message. This document contains fields that may refer to other files. Do you want to update the fields in this document? And this is behavior that is in Word that you can't get around without doing a bit of programming. I'll show you in subsequent screencasts how you can get around this in two separate ways. For right now, though, I'm just going to click yes. And when I click yes, it updates that table of content. If I save this and close it, go back to Visual Studio, it will tell me that test.docx has been changed outside the editor. Do you wish to reload it? And I'll say yes. And I'm going to open up document.xml again. Here is the field, the TOC field. The begin occurs here. The separate occurs here. All of the content between the separate and the end was again automatically generated by Word when we opened the document and responded positively to that question. By responding positively to that question, we caused Word to do the pagination of the document and then update the table of content. And the way it updated the table of contents is that it regenerated all of the content between the separate and the end. Key point about this is that if you're going to cause Word or Word Automation Services to update this table, you're free to insert the table of content without the contents between the separate and the end. If this field notation with these begin, separate, and end elements are unfamiliar to you, I've recorded a two-part screencast that is a deep dive into fields in OpenXML, Word Processing ML. You could find that screencast here. This concludes the first in this series of screencasts on inserting and updating tables of contents in Word Processing ML documents. In the next screencast, I'm going to look at a bit of code that is part of the Power Tools for OpenXML project that makes it easier to work with tables of contents.